Alright, we need to talk about Lon'qu from Fire Emblem Awakening. I think he's a very niche but underrated character. Although his use cases can be specific, he's also very, very good at what he does. He joins the game with good combat, works well as a pair-up for other units, giving a vital bonus to speed that many characters appreciate, especially on Lunatic and Lunatic Plus, and while he's definitely not going to replace the top characters in any specific role, he can't enemy phase as well as Robin or Vake. He can never get Gale Force, so he's limited to removing a single enemy per turn, and the weird thing is that despite all of these shortcomings, he can still be an incredibly useful character to have around, certainly for the first few chapters after he joins, and if you build him up, he will continue to provide value for as long as you need. First of all, I want to acknowledge something. I absolutely love Lon'qu. He's one of my favorite units in the game. I think his design is awesome, his character gimmick is hilarious, it's executed well in support conversations and in the story, and he's a fun unit who fits right into the mold of the style of gameplay that I personally find to be super fun and rewarding, especially those big moments where you dodge an attack or land a crit at the absolutely most crucial moment. To me, that feeling can be almost as good as having a perfectly planned turn go exactly as planned. That scene where you realize that you have absolutely no guaranteed way to win from your current position, all you can do is play to your best possible odds, and then Lon'qu goes off, completely saving your run. We are going to talk about that moment, because I think it's something that many players fundamentally misunderstand, and that explanation is also fundamental to accepting Lon'qu and utilizing him as a unit. People have reservations about so-called relying on luck, but before we get into talking about that, I basically just wanted to say that obviously I will try to be as impartial as possible, but if other people have different thoughts about Lon'qu, that of course everyone is entitled to their own opinion. This video isn't meant to tell you that Lon'qu is the best character in the game, just because I personally enjoy using him. I don't even think he's the best character in the game. Rather, what I'm talking about is a character that I like, and I'm trying to explain to you the best way to make use of his unique strengths if you also like him or if you also want to use him. To me, the ideal Fire Emblem experience is not figuring out the best 4 units and using them over and over again to play the exact same game repeatedly to prove just how fast or smart or how dominant I can clear it. For me, Fire Emblem is about picking my favorite characters, regardless of how good they are, and finding the ways to make them work. Sometimes that means finding the best way to make Lon'qu work, and sometimes it's just finding a creative way to make Lon'qu work. You don't always need to think about doing the best possible thing at every moment of every game. It's very stressful, and it's honestly pretty boring in my opinion. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's first look at Lon'qu and how he compares to his nearest contemporaries. To do that, we need to accept a definition of what Lon'qu is and what it is that he does. Lon'qu is an early joining sword-locked character. He starts with good combat and a speed pair-up. He makes an effective Levin sword and killing edge user from the moment he joins the team, and in the long term, he will always get Vantage before switching to other class lines, with potential as a bow user, staff user, Locktouch user, even a Wyvern rider. He is surprisingly flexible in how you can build him for the long term, especially in terms of those utility roles and how he can support other characters. And this is the key to Lon'qu in terms of building him, because he starts with good combat and great speed. Speed is arguably the most important stat, and especially with the super high enemy quality in Fire Emblem Awakening, it's pretty difficult to have too much speed. You can't go past the point of diminishing returns here, and for this reason, his very high speed stat and speed growth, actually it's pretty much always relevant at every stage in the game. And overall what this means, what I'm trying to get to here is that if you ever want to turn Lon'qu into a utility character, he's going to have good combat on top of his utility role. His speed never goes away, and so his combat ability doesn't diminish just because you made him into a supporter. He just becomes a supporter with good combat. We already know what this looks like in the game, and we know it's very good. We have Anna, a character who can open locks, use staves, gives great parrot bonuses, and she can even fight on turns when she needs to. You might say that if you already have Anna that you don't need Lon'qu, and depending on the size of your team, that might even be true. But there's no real downside to having a second Anna if you have the deployment slots available. And Lon'qu doesn't always fill the same niche, and he doesn't compete directly with Anna. Not always. Even if he was going to, I would say this. Anna's biggest weakness is her extremely limited support pool. Well, Lon'qu has a much bigger list of characters that he can support with, and crucially, he can S support with almost any female shepherd of your choosing, which is something that Anna could never do. Even if her list was bigger, she would support with male characters, where Lon'qu would support with female characters. So he enables builds and pairings that Anna is just incapable of making. So he does have a unique niche that is separate from her. Now, putting Anna aside, in the immediate term, let's look at the characters who actually share the above traits I mentioned with Lon'qu. I would say the best qualifiers are going to be Chrom, Gaius, and Robin. Out of this group, Lon'qu is the only one who joins with C rank in swords. And at this point in the game, having C rank already available is pretty noteworthy. It's still pretty early on. You could get Chrom or Robin to C rank in swords if you focus really hard on training their sword rank in the first 4 chapters, but this can be pretty difficult to do depending on the conditions. Even when I actively try to get Robin to C swords fast enough, I sometimes still fail to meet that requirement. This means that when Lon'qu joins, it's fairly likely that he's going to be the only character capable of using the Levin Sword and the Killing Edge, and these are both extremely effective tools to help counteract the overwhelming stats and skills of enemies on Lunatic and especially Lunatic Plus. Just being able to hold the Levin Sword is a trait that is worth recognizing as a huge positive. But surprisingly, Lon'qu is actually probably the best user of it, aside from Robin. He's going to have better magic on average than Gregor, Gaius, and Chrom. Now, technically, anyone with the Killing Edge is going to have a high crit rate. Even though Lon'qu starts with it in his inventory, which could make you feel obligated to keep it in his hands, you have to acknowledge it's true that you could just take it away, bench him, and give it to anyone else. Killing weapons are very solid in Awakening. At the basic level, they're almost as good as silver weapons, but they only require C rank to wield. The fact that they have an insane crit bonus on top of that is just an extra blessing. One that we can and will utilize for specific purposes, but I'm going to talk about those later. For now, I'll just say that I do typically keep the Killing Edge in Lon'qu's hands for a while, and this mostly comes down to the fact that other characters tend to have other things that they'd rather be doing. It just so happens to work out that Lon'qu is in this role where he fights a small number of very important combats that he needs to win, and this allows him to make the best use of the Killing Edge without breaking it too quickly because he's not attacking very often. But if we want to look at a statistical analysis, Lon'qu has the highest skill growth of any of these characters, with the exception of a plus skill Robin. In fact, the only character who matches his skill growth in the entire game is Panne, Gangrel, and plus skill Robin. You're probably not using Gangrel, especially not in Chapter 5, and you're probably not using skill Robin. And either way, what this ultimately means is that Lon'qu is tied for having most likely the highest base crit rate in the game before accounting for skills. And this is important, so let's hold on to this for later. What we essentially have here is a unit who joins early on, pre-trained with good stats and good sword rank, and he also happens to be quite arguably the best user of the 2 best C-rank swords that you get early on. In many cases, he's going to be your only potential user of those swords until his rivals go through a bit more training, and this makes him immediately useful and immediately worth fielding. Well, I will say, in terms of strength and defense, he's behind all of the characters that I mentioned above. Chrom, Gaius, Panne, Robin, all of them have better strength and better defensive bulk. So you might think, why would I rely on this guy who needs to crit and who needs to dodge when you could instead rely on someone who has more consistent combat? And I think this speaks to the underlying misunderstanding about what Lon'qu really does and what the word consistency means. Because at the end of the day, his combat already is good enough. A few extra points in strength, HP, or defense in many situations won't actually change the matchup. And you know what? I keep saying we'll talk about it later, but let's just go ahead and talk about it right now. I want to explain why high variance characters and high variance strategies are not only actually good, but can increase your chances of winning if wielded correctly. These strats are not the same as blindly relying on good luck. Instead, you have 2 situations. First is when good luck can help you, but if you don't get lucky, you still win anyway. The second situation is where you have a chance to lose, and you cannot find a 100% safe line. It's impossible. There's no way to guarantee victory. In that situation, your only option is to make the best possible play to maximize your chance of succeeding. Now, let's take a quick example of the first case. These are the situations where you're always going to win no matter which character you use, but having good luck can still help you. Number 1. If an enemy hits Lon'qu for 20 out of 22 HP, he survives and he hits them back for 15 damage. Lon'qu couldn't take another hit, but on his turn, he hits the enemy for 15 more damage and they die. If that same enemy hits Chrom for 19 out of 24 HP, he survives and he hits them back for 17 damage. Chrom couldn't take another hit, but on his turn, he hits the enemy for 17 more damage and they die. You see how, despite Chrom having more strength, HP, and defense, the situation is exactly the same. Chrom's stats aren't actually higher enough to make a difference. It's all cosmetic. It might make you feel better to say that Chrom has more strength, he might feel more bulky, but they both die in 2 hits. He might feel stronger, but they both 2-shot the enemy. The difference is actually that Lon'qu is more likely to dodge, and here's the thing, when you dodge an attack, that is actually a much bigger deal than taking 2 less damage, because in that situation, Lon'qu is taking 20 less damage. And not only does Lon'qu have higher speed, but he also comes with evade plus 10, which we haven't even talked about yet. I had an entire discussion in my team building video about how strong evade plus 10 actually is, how it reduces enemy chances to hit you by more than 10% in almost every situation because of the dual RN system. Go check out that video if you want a more complete explanation, but the short version is this. Lon'qu is usually better at dodging than any other character in the early game. If you compare him to Gaius, who has almost the exact same stats, the main difference between them is that Lon'qu has that crucial plus 10 evade skill, which is worth more than 10 points. It's not unreasonable to say that Lon'qu is going to have 3 more points of speed than Chrom around the time when he joins, if they're at the same level, and this gap is only going to grow wider over time because of Lon'qu's better speed growth. He also has good luck, which also factors into evasion in this game. At worst, Lon'qu is usually going to have around 5 more points of evasion than Chrom, just based on their stat differences, and then another plus 10 on top of that because of his skill. Now, I know the numbers talk can be a little bit boring, I don't even love it myself, but I promise that I am going somewhere with this, and I promise you it will be interesting, so stick with me for just a minute. Let's look at the same combat again, the same combat I talked about above, and let's think about what evasion does for us in this scenario. I'll give the enemy a 60% hit chance against Chrom, and I'll even say that the enemy is using a sword, so there's no weapon triangle advantage, because that would actually benefit Lon'qu even more. With his higher sword rank, he would gain even more evasion. Based on true hit, this enemy has a 68% chance to deal 19 damage to Chrom. Now factoring in the extra 14 evasion that we gave Lon'qu, the enemy has 45 displayed hit against him, which is actually only a 40% chance to hit Lon'qu. So first of all, let's appreciate the fact that these 15 points of evasion are actually making it 28% less likely for the enemy to hit Lon'qu. Each point of evasion is actually worth almost twice as much as what the game is telling you. Secondly, let's think about expected damage that each character will receive. This is a mathematical model. 68% of the time, Chrom will receive 19 damage, otherwise he takes 0. So on average, Chrom is expected to take 12.9 damage, and we'll say 13. 40% of the time, Lon'qu will receive 20 damage, otherwise he takes 0. On average, Lon'qu is expected to take only 8 damage every time he's attacked, and this one rounds off nicely on its own, so we don't even have to round it. So what's interesting here is that even though Chrom has higher defense and HP, because evasion is a much bigger momentum swing, dodging an attack has a much bigger impact than just reducing the damage by 1 or 2 points. And because Lon'qu is much more likely to dodge, it turns out that on average, Lon'qu is actually taking less damage. Now, this is all hypothetical, right? How and where and why would you find a way to make use of this information? Well, let's say that Lon'qu and Chrom have to fight 2 enemies. We already determined that both of them die if they get hit twice, but we've also just mathematically proven that Chrom, on average, will die if he fights 2 enemies, because he's expected to take 13 damage twice, which is 26 damage total. But Lon'qu is typically going to survive, because he's expected to take 8 damage twice, and only 16 damage total on average. And the more enemies they fight, the more the average begins to regress to the mean. So while you might get screwed over if you get unlucky on one individual attack, the truth is that over a long enough period of time, Lon'qu is actually the more reliable character. If he fights 100 combats, he's expected to take way less damage than Chrom over the course of a full campaign. And you can use this to your advantage in situations where dodging helps, but isn't mandatory. It saves on vulneraries, It allows Lissa to use her action healing other characters. It allows Lon'qu to keep pushing forward and gaining momentum rather than needing to retreat and heal. He makes better use of forts and defensive terrain because of the stacking evasion principles we've already discussed. And on top of all of this, I didn't even mention, in this combat situation where Lon'qu has 3 more speed than Chrom, he's less likely to be doubled, which means he's taking even less damage, and he's more likely to double the enemies, which means he's dishing out even more damage. Rather than looking at this combat forecast of a single round of combat and determining that Chrom is better because he takes 2 less damage, it's very important to assess these characters' value over a long period of time. And this brings us to the other situation that I need to discuss. That is having a bailout option. Lon'qu might be the best bailout character that you ever get for free. There are ways to make more powerful builds, of course, but don't underestimate the value of someone who is just good at something and can be utilized right away with no additional prep. The most obvious example would be what we've already discussed above. If you need someone to fight 2 sword-wielding enemies, you can actually tell just at a glance by looking at their dodge chance that if you use Lon'qu, he's more likely to dodge at least 1 enemy attack, while Chrom is more likely to get hit by both. 60 displayed hit versus 45 displayed hit. That's pretty easy to understand, right? I didn't really need to go out of my way to mathematically prove that, but I did it anyway, because sometimes seeing the numbers can help people understand things that overcome their subconscious biases. And one personal bias that many people have is not relying on luck in order to win. But here's the thing. If I'm playing the game, and I get into a situation where 2 enemies have already crossed into my back line, and the only way to stop them is by putting a character in the choke point and hoping that I dodge at least 1 attack, I'm going to use the character who has the highest chance of dodging. I don't care what anyone says or thinks about this. I'm not going to just reset my game because I had a 16% chance to lose. What I'm going to do is look at all of the available information and make the best play available to maximize my odds of success. And by the way, that 16% number is real. It's based on the combat that we calculated above. In the same situation, Chrom has a 46% chance of dying, and Lon'qu only has a 16% chance of dying. In my opinion, you would be very silly to use the character with a much higher chance of dying just because of a stubborn adherence to the idea that only consistent strategies are worthwhile, while completely overlooking the fact that you are using the mathematically less consistent strategy in the short term and in the long term. And for people who just immediately reset their game if they can't find a plan that's 100% consistent, I have nothing to say about that. We obviously have a completely different view on how video games are played. Strength, defense, and HP do not tell the whole story, especially in a game like Awakening where your characters will fight dozens or hundreds of times. And the system is very kind to evasion builds and very rewarding to crit builds. On that note, critical hits follow a very similar principle. I'm not going to bore you with the whole math thing again, but just think about it. Having 2 extra points of damage all the time is nice, sure, but critical hits multiply your damage by 3 times. And just like with evasion, dropping 20 damage to 0 damage is a huge difference. And offensively, tripling 15 damage to 45 damage is so much more impactful than increasing 15 to 17 damage. Especially if 15 and 17 are both going to 2-shot the same enemy, but 45 damage will 1-shot that enemy. The potential to 1-shot an enemy is key. That is a much bigger momentum swing than just having 2 extra damage in situations where it does nothing. This is especially true once you start to look at Lunatic Plus and play Lunatic Plus the way that I mostly do now. You can offset enemies with Pavis by rolling crits. You can also use Lon'qu, or anyone with the killing edge, technically, as a way to potentially play around counter if you have no other options. And this does happen sometimes, and it will happen, and it's better to be prepared than to not be prepared. This is your bailout option. If your available melee roster consists of Robin, Chrom, and Vake only, and an enemy with counter runs at your team, and you have to enemy phase them for whatever reason, this can very often be a situation where you have a 0% chance to survive. The enemy getting counter as their skill forces a 100% game over, and there's nothing you can do about it. But this isn't exactly true. There is something you can do about it. You can maximize your chance of success by using Lon'qu. Let's say instead that you've relegated Chrom to a pair-up role, and your melee fighters are Lon'qu, Robin, and Vake. Lon'qu has a 37% chance to crit the enemy. If he crits, he will one-shot them, and if he one-shots them, he does not take any counter damage, and he survives. Now, 37% is not what I would call reliable, but it's infinitely more likely than 0%. You have turned a guaranteed game over into a 37% chance to win. Again, like with the example about dodging one attack from two enemies, it's obviously better to never get into this situation, but Lunatic Plus especially is a very chaotic game mode, and not every player is going to play the game perfectly anyway. You can't always control what's going to happen, so if you do get into a situation, let me ask you, what do you think is better? A 100% chance to reset your game and lose 40 minutes of progress, or a 63% chance to get a game over and lose 40 minutes of progress? The Lon'qu build only loses about 25 minutes of time on average, compared to the quote-unquote consistent build, which always consistently loses 40 minutes of my time. But here's the kicker. Even if you get as unlucky as possible, even if Lon'qu never crits, even if Lon'qu never dodges, in the absolute worst case scenario, you still only lose the exact same 40 minutes of progress. And this is the central part of understanding why high variance builds are actually good. And this is the line I've been holding back all this time. Lon'qu's variance doesn't swing from being worse to other characters to being better than other characters. His variance starts at the same level as other characters and just gets even better than them. Everybody two-shots this enemy, but Lon'qu can sometimes one-shot them. Everyone survives one combat, but Lon'qu can sometimes survive 2, 3, or even 4 combats. People have this expectation that you're either going to get unlucky and get a bad outcome, or get lucky and get a good outcome. But that's not how Evade plus 10, Killing Edge builds work. If you get unlucky, you just get the normal expected outcome, the same exact outcome that you would have gotten using Chrom or Vake. But if you get lucky, you suddenly get a massive spike in momentum. You get a huge return on the value that you put in. You turn a game over into a successful attempt. You instantly remove a difficult enemy instead of leaving them hanging around. This keeps one of your frontline fighters on full health. This keeps your backline clear of enemies. You get to keep fighting without needing to stop and heal and support your characters. This is where Lon'qu really shines compared to early Robin, Chrom, and Gaius. He is more likely to produce high variance outcomes, which always range from, at worst, the same thing as Robin, Chrom, or Gaius, but in the best situation, he can be 3 times as good as them, or even better. The comparison here isn't 15 damage versus 17 damage. We're looking at 4 characters who have functionally in most situations the same baseline combat, except one of them, Lon'qu, can just pop off and delete the opponent 40% of the time, or even more often. He reduces the damage that he takes not by 2 points, but he completely nullifies it to 0 damage more often than any of the other fighters by a significant margin. If Lon'qu's outcomes ranged from 50 to 150, while everyone else was a nice consistent 100, I would get that, I really would. In that case, you could make a solid argument to stick with the consistent strats and not rely on luck. But that is a false understanding of the situation, which completely ignores math in favor of just using your feelings. The mathematical reality here is that everyone starts at a consistent 100, but Lon'qu has the best possible odds to jump to an insane 300. You can just use this on a turn-by-turn basis by having him act early on, and then adapting your strategy based on which line you get. He enables quick reset strategies that are otherwise impossible. He enables LTC strategies that are otherwise either impossible or extremely unlikely. And as a bailout option, he is the best possible unit to save you from a game over and not waste your time resetting the game when you didn't need to. Not by relying on luck, but instead, when you get bad luck, unreasonably unfortunate enemy skill combinations, he has a chance to counteract the bad luck and help you recover with the highest possible odds of success. You need to understand this to understand why Lon'qu is so good. Funny enough, the enemies seem to understand it better than some players. If their expected damage is low enough, due to his increased evasion chance, enemies will favor attacking other characters. Even if they could potentially deal more damage to Lon'qu, the enemy behavior is based on statistics, and the numbers don't lie. They're going to go after the unit that they deal more expected damage to. Moving down the list, Lon'qu is the only Generation 1 early joining character who gets Vantage without needing to use a second seal. This alone has value for several reasons. First of all, it's because, well, he has it, which is obviously good. It synergizes well with his existing strategy. If he does get unlucky and gets hit and his HP is below half, and enemies are still trying to kill him, he could potentially hit them first and just kill them. This increases his survival beyond just looking at his dodge chance, which is already very good, and makes him deceptively even more tanky, despite his lack of HP and defense. In truth, though, I think Generation 2 characters are the best users of Vantage, and this is because Vantage benefits from having a complete build. Thankfully, because Lon'qu gets such convenient access to Vantage, this makes him one of the most convenient parents for passing down Vantage to a child. So even if he's not going to stick around for the long term, he can be an extremely valuable asset to your overall team building because of his ability to give Vantage to another character who will become strong in the long term. And remember, to have Lon'qu pass down Vantage does not require any second seal or even master seal usage. It's a very low cost for a very solid investment. Looking at the other potential utility roles, bow user, staff user, Locktouch, or Wyvern rider, there are better characters at pretty much all of these roles, but I am going to talk about his strengths and weaknesses in each of these roles. So first of all, as a staff user, his magic stat is never going to be as good as a purely magical focused character. However, it's pretty good, and just being able to hold a staff is actually quite useful. His magic stat is not completely terrible. His base magic is above 0, and he can get more magic from class and promotion bonuses, and his magic growth isn't worthless either. So once you get him into Trickster, he will continue to gain even more magic. He's not going to replace your long-range rescue staff users, but that's not the point. He can still use short-range rescue. He can heal, mend, and ward allies while having good enough combat to stay on the front lines. And this is kind of important, this is a little bit useful, but to be honest, the main reason to make him into a Trickster would be to get those awesome parrot bonuses onto another character. Magic, skill, speed, and even +1 movement. This is a pair of stat line that almost any magical character would love. He can technically get access to Locktouch, but it's a bit of a workaround. I would say that the best situation where Lon'qu could be considered a viable Locktouch user is if you know you're going to use him for the long term. Like if you've already planned out all of your builds and you're saying, I want to use Lon'qu, and you just happen to have an extra second seal early on. If you send him over to Thief as soon as possible, he effectively just gains an extra 10 levels worth of stats as a Thief, continuing to gain unpromoted levels without too big of an internal level penalty. And this can be nice early on when you don't have very many Master Seals and your other team members are competing over them, especially since you're getting Locktouch and +1 move, because those are good skills. And out of every character who can do this, Lon'qu is probably the most qualified to train himself back out of a level 1 Thief, just because he's already such a good sword user. Eventually, later on, when you get access to infinite Master Seals, you just promote him into Assassin, which is probably what he was going to do anyway, or you send him over to Trickster to get that unique Trickster benefit that we already talked about. Speaking of Assassins, Lon'qu is a solid bow user. Now, granted, he can never get bow fair, which is sad, but still, the ability to use a bow to double enemies to hit hard enough with effective 3 times damage cannot be overstated. And Assassin is a really solid combat class anyway, so having that extra utility of being able to break out effective damage is really valuable. More than you might imagine if you've never tried or if you haven't played very much Awakening. I think Assassin is significantly better than Swordmaster in this game specifically. Lethality also synergizes with what Lon'qu is already trying to do. You're taking that 40% chance to crit and then just adding an additional +% chance roll on top of every attack. With conditional probability, you could instantly delete the enemy with lethality. It makes his high variance outcomes even more likely on a turn-by-turn basis and over the long run. Lastly, as a Wyvern rider, he is probably one of the worst early Wyvern options. Frederick, Panne, Sully, and Robin can all make much better arguments for getting the early second seal if you're looking to add an extra flyer to the team. Now, having said that, Lon'qu himself does very well in the Wyvern line. You do need to train his axe rank, which is a bit of a step back, but in the long run, it gives him access to some of the best evasion skills in the game, and the ability to fly is always appreciated. So if you're looking for an early Wyvern, Lon'qu is not likely to be your first choice. But if you are looking for things to do with Lon'qu, Wyvern is a valid entry on his own personal list. It would have been awesome if Wyvern Lord had axe and sword usage in this game, allowing him to keep his sword rank, but sadly that's not the case. In fact, there are no flying classes in this game that use swords. Pretty weird, huh? Sometimes you don't even notice things like that until they're pointed out to you. As for training Lon'qu, if you plan to use him, it should be no problem at all. Just let him fight the matchups that are good for him, always deploy him, and be ready to use him or rely on him as a consistent or bailout option if you get into a bad situation or an otherwise unwinnable situation. He will naturally continue to pick up experience, and there is no doubt in my mind that he will reach level 10 before Chapter 12. In fact, he's one of the characters who can pretty easily reach level 10 early enough to use almost any of the early Master Seals that you find before Chapter 12 if you want him to. It is tricky because there are usually other characters who want those Master Seals even more and want to promote as soon as possible, but still, especially if Anna shows up and allows you to buy extra Master Seals, the promo bonuses are insane. Notably, he gets plus 5 HP and plus 4 strength by going into Assassin, on top of a bunch of other stats. Remember, this is a character who doubles a lot and crits a lot, so plus 4 strength can actually reliably be counted as plus 8 damage, and if you get lucky, it could be as much as 24 damage. By the same logic, getting access to Swordfare as soon as possible will represent a pretty large damage increase. So this is the best argument for going into Swordmaster. In terms of all other stats, I would say Assassin is pretty much the same thing, just better. They have almost the same combat, almost the same parrot bonuses, but Assassin can use bows, which are way more useful. And while this might be a hot take, most likely because my brain has been permanently warped by playing Lunatic Plus, I think that lethality is significantly better than Astra. Astra, like in my mind, is essentially just a chance to hit yourself for 5 times with counter damage, while lethality is a chance to instantly remove an enemy and completely bypass counter. I'm not even kidding, on most of my characters, I genuinely remove Astra from my skill list as soon as possible when I'm playing Lunatic Plus, but typically what I do is go through Assassin anyway because it's a better class. However, if you want Swordfare for Lon'qu or to pass it down to his child, going directly into Swordmaster will get him access to it faster than any other character in the game can ever obtain it. And that's key. Just like with Vantage, he has the unique ability to pass this down to Generation 2 with a very direct line and minimal EXP feeding. To be honest, I'm not big on swords in Awakening. I think it is the worst weapon class, so this is one main reason why I rarely bother with this path. Getting him into Assassin and using bows, even without bowfare, is usually way more powerful in my mind. It really is too bad that he can't get into Sniper, because being able to fish for lethality, crits, and just dealing chip damage at 3 range with the longbow would be so hilarious, but also surprisingly deadly. Interestingly, there's only one character in the first generation who can become a lethality or an Astra sniper, and it's not Lon'qu. The other appealing thing about Assassin is that you get pass. This is one of those skills that would be really nice to have, but is rarely worth going out of your way to get. However, because Assassin is extremely good, you're not really going out of your way, you just pick it up for free while training through what is arguably your best class line anyway. And once you do have pass, you'll realize all of the little situations where it does help out, even in small ways. Now, unlike with Miriel, we don't have a wide range of different class and reclass options to discuss. The Lon'qu build is a lot more straightforward. Yes, you could use him for any of the utility roles that I mentioned earlier. You could use him as an assassin or a swordmaster, but typically once Lon'qu settles into his role, you're not likely to keep switching him around, and unlike Miriel, he doesn't have like 6 different good options. Like, even after I get past, I'm just going to keep him in assassin and keep reclassing him through assassin, because a bow sword using unit is pretty much good for the rest of the game. If you're using him as a trickster, you're just going to keep him as a trickster. The same logic applies. This might seem like a drawback, and arguably it could be, but let's talk about the upsides. First of all, you save a lot of resources. You don't have to use a lot of second seals or master seals on units like Lon'qu. If he's already good and he doesn't need to reclass, this just means you have more seals available to give to other characters who do need to reclass. And that's great. Also, because this build is so straightforward, it's pretty much impossible to mess it up. You just keep gaining levels and you just keep getting stronger. I know some people complain about the skill bloat in new Fire Emblem games and how you need to think so much about all of the different skills and classes and what they all do in order to make your builds, when you'd rather just play the game without needing to spend all of that time planning builds. I think Lon'qu is a character who would appeal to that type of player, because he has a straightforward build that you can utilize, and it's very nostalgic, it's very familiar to how Myrmidons work in GBA Emblem. You just level him up to level 20, and then you promote him, and he just works like that. You don't need to think about his build. The main difference is that he's way stronger than the GBA Myrmidons because he's actually very good. And in this game, Assassin is extremely valid, not just for the cool animation on Silencer, or in this case Lethality, but because here, Assassin is genuinely a very strong class. It's arguably even better than Swordmaster. Now, I was planning on saving that whole discussion on high variance play for much later in the video, but I couldn't resist and I had to get into it early on. So instead, for our last discussion, let's talk about his potential supports and his role in the team as a whole. First of all, the Myrmidon line is actually completely neutral when it comes to physical versus magical builds. Thinking of Myrmidon as a physical class is the first bias that you need to set aside. It doesn't give any strength bonus at all. It's just pure speed, which any character appreciates having. Offensive characters want more speed. Defensive characters want more speed. Axe fighters, lance fighters, archers, mages, everybody, all of them wants more speed. In this game, enemy speed stats are so bloated in the higher difficulties. In some cases, Lon'qu can give +9 speed to his partner, and that's just barely enough. Being a speed partner is so valuable. If anything, his potential to go into Trickster makes him even better at supporting magical wives. So do not think of Lon'qu as a physical supporter. He's like neutral, or you can make him slightly magic or strength focused. But the driving point here is that he supports almost any character that you want him to. And it's also not too difficult to find a good reason why almost any character is good at supporting him, because he already has enough speed innately, and he can make use of almost any other stat. Even magic, if he gets it, is nice because it makes his Levin sword even stronger. Now, before we get into specific pairings, I do want to talk about Lon'qu and his potential as a father. First of all, he does fit into the role of what I like to call a Locktouch Father. This is a small group of units who could potentially be used to pass Locktouch directly to a child, and then the father gets permanently retired. If you're not planning on using Lon'qu in the long term, it can be worth it to use him in this way. Now granted, you do get Anna in this game for free, and she does have Locktouch and she is a very good unit. Given her lack of supports and the limited number of deployment slots, you may find in some situations, if you are building a full team, it can be useful to have a Locktouch unit of your own. That way you don't need to bench one of your main team members every time you need to deploy Anna. Instead, your team member just has Locktouch. Furthermore, there is at least one chapter in the game where it's very useful to have 2 Locktouch units, and taking a low-level unpromoted Gaius off the bench to deploy him, just to open one chest, usually leads to pretty bad results because you're weakening your combat force by an additional character, and you have to worry about keeping Gaius safe. So the way this works is that once you get Lon'qu to level 10 or above, you just need to make sure that he obtains the S-rank support with his chosen partner. Let's use Cherche as an example. When you're ready to recruit Gerome, you need to use a second seal to turn Lon'qu into a thief. Unlike in Fates, Lon'qu does not need to gain any additional experience. He will get Locktouch immediately. This allows him to pass it down to his child, and there is value to doing this, because again, unlike in Fates, there is no backlog of skills. If Gerome wants to get Locktouch on his own, he needs to reset to a level 1 thief to get it. But even though he has Locktouch now that he's done that, he still needs to train back up to a level 10 thief before he can do anything else. This massive detour of taking 10 extra levels to gain a level 1 unpromoted skill drastically changes how you plan builds and inheritance in Awakening. The value of passing down a level 1 skill is massively inflated, because it's essentially the same cost as passing down a level 10 skill. Either way, the child normally needs to train for 10 levels to get Locktouch or to get Move +1. So in Awakening, these two skills have the same cost. You always want to pass down skills like this whenever you can, and there is even an argument, in my opinion, for passing down these basic skills instead of passing down promoted skills. Because in some cases, it's easier to fight and gain levels as a promoted class. The child can learn lethality on their own. They can learn pass on their own just by fighting as an assassin, but it's difficult for them to go back and get Locktouch on their own. Now, obviously, there's going to be some nuance to this. There's going to be cases where you do want to pass down level 15 skills or even level 5 skills, but still don't discount the value of using a Locktouch Father to get a Locktouch unit on your permanent team. It's one of the few ways in this game to solve the Locktouch problem, where the game naturally gives you very, very few viable Locktouch units, and it's really helpful if you know how to build them on your own to make a more optimal team. But we're getting outside the scope of a Lon'qu video. For now, let's look at the individual pairings and see how Lon'qu functions as a husband and as a father. I know in my Miriel video I didn't talk too much about LAURENT. but this is because Miriel can only ever be the parent for one child. Male characters are a little different. Because they can serve as a parent for potentially up to 12 different Generation 2 builds, obviously not all in the same playthrough, but for this reason, it's worth discussing the traits, stats, and abilities they pass down to each child. Let's start at the top of the list with Lissa. As a trickster, as a swordmaster, Lon'qu does a very good job of supporting Lissa. She's naturally decently fast, but she's not fast enough to double the quickest enemies. With a +9 or +10 speed pair-up from Lon'qu, this pushes Lissa over the top and makes Sage Lissa into a more reliable offensive powerhouse. This pairing is especially useful if you want to send her into Dark Flyer, with or without Tomefare, just because the ability to reliably double and to bait in dual strikes from an assassin, swordmaster, or trickster Lon'qu is going to improve her combat greatly as she's leveling up to level 15 Dark Flyer, and it's going to continue to help with her consistency in removing enemies and triggering Gale Force. Unfortunately, because Owain starts in the Myrmidon class, he's one of the few characters who does not benefit from Lon'qu passing down Vantage. He does give Owain access to a flying class in Wyvern Rider, but this isn't the only father that Owain can get it from, and I would say the best thing you can do is to inherit a skill like Pass, Swordfare, Locktouch Lon'qu 7, or any of the breaker skills. This can be used to save Owain the time he would have spent grinding levels through those class lines. On the plus side, this version of Owain will have very good mods in magic, skill, speed, and luck, which makes him a great option for Sage. Yes, his magic will be slightly lower than if you used someone like Rickon or Henry as a father, but we've already discussed in this video why having a few extra points of speed and skill can actually be much better than having a few extra points of attack. If Owain is dodging and critting more often in this game, that's going to lead to more favorable outcomes over time. +5 magic from Rickon or +3 magic from Lon'qu only matters if the Rickon genetics are allowing him to exactly one-shot enemies with an extra 2 points of damage. This is a situation that rarely comes up and can be fixed with a tonic. Next up is Olivia, a character who doesn't support very well and doesn't receive supports very well. In a no-grinding context, at least, you're never going to be using Olivia for serious combat, and you basically never want her to be paired up with anyone. The best use case scenario here would be thinking of Lon'qu as your convoy guard, like from the GBA emblem. Essentially, Lon'qu just hangs out in the back at all times. He's either going to be paired up with Olivia to give her some extra stats, or body blocking Olivia to give her an extra layer of defense to keep her safe from enemies that could get past your other characters. However, with good positioning and good tactics, enemies basically never get past your forward line, so this pairing does end up feeling like a bit of a waste. Having said that, Inigo is a natural soul tank. He does have access to Vantage in his innate class set, but if you have Lon'qu pass it down, this avoids the problem of needing to train 10 levels through Myrmidon to get Vantage, and then still figuring out a way to get back into Hero. Instead, you can just inherit Vantage and promote directly into Hero. This is one of the fastest ways to get Inigo's build online, and I do highly recommend it if you're interested in using Inigo. If you want to use him as your soul tank, I think Lon'qu is one of his best potential fathers. You might think that his bad defense and resistance are an issue, and certainly there are downsides, but every character has pros and every character has cons. And with Lon'qu as a father, Inigo is going to be dodging attacks more often, he's going to be critting attacks more often, he's going to be activating soul more often, and all of these qualities are far more important for your soul tank compared to just taking 2 less points of damage. Again, use a defense tonic, get a defensive para partner. Either of those options is a much lower cost than giving up 3 points of speed just to get 2 points of defense from your father. Speed is the most valuable stat, and you can get a ton of it from Lon'qu, so if you can get it, make the best use of it. Speaking of, let's talk about the Maribelle pair-up, because this is one of the pairings I feel benefits all of the characters, and it might be one of Lon'qu's best overall options, at least in terms of his versatility. Lon'qu is already great at dodging attacks, Lon'qu is already great at landing critical hits, but the extra benefits from Demoiselle, from Dual Support Plus, they can push him to the absolute limit. You can make it so that enemies have a 0% chance to hit Lon'qu, and you can easily push his crit rate to absurd levels. All you need to do is pair him up with Valkyrie and Maribelle. Now, the one downside of this formation is that Lon'qu isn't getting many stats that he cares about from Valkyrie, and I won't dispute that, but his combat stats are already pretty good on their own, and this is one of the cases where the value he gets from support skills is worth more than the value he would get from those stats. Plus, if you're baiting in dual strikes from a tome user, that has good value as well. If her job is to support Lon'qu all the time, you can consider switching Maribelle over to a Falcon Knight at some point. The extra speed he gets will allow him to double even enemy swordmasters pretty comfortably. On the other hand, Lon'qu supports Maribelle pretty well. Similar to pairing with Lissa, You just stick him in Swordmaster or Trickster for the best stats in order to improve her combat and her survivability, or you go with Assassin if you want Lon'qu to be landing those dual strikes with a bow, which is one of the best dual striking weapon types. Assassin is also good at supporting her while she trains through the Dark Flyer line. Remember that Maribelle benefits from her own dual support plus aura, so when she's fully trained, she's effectively a character with hit, avoid, crit, and dodge bonuses all equipped into a single skill slot. The extra speed from Lon'qu is just going to make it even harder for enemies to hit her, harder for enemies to double her. Although Maribelle is not an amazing dodge tank, she will be able to double and remove almost any target with a single round of combat. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention all of the value that Lon'qu gives to Brady. Not only does he make essentially the fastest and most deadly version of Sage Brady, similar to what he does for Owain, but in this case he also has a lot more potential to pass down skills and class access. There's no overlap between Brady's natural class set and the classes that he inherits from Lon'qu. As a result, using Lon'qu as a father not only gives him awesome stats, it also gives him access to entire new archetypes of builds, and you've also got flexibility to pass down good skills without any redundancy. Unlike Owain, Brady can promote directly into Sage. Also, I was hating on Astra a bit earlier, but I will say that one of the best uses for it is going to be sticking it on a character who always fights at 2 range and will never be in danger of enemies from counter. If Sage Brady is going to be purely used as player phase removal, the chance to hit the target 5 times with his tome every time he attacks, with a +5 skill mod from Lon'qu, boosting the Astra activation rate even further, is very enticing. It's a very good idea, and having a chance to dual strike, to crit, or to proc Astra on every single attack is going to accelerate his offense so much. Just make sure not to attack from 1 range against foes with counter. Lon'qu and Sully make a great pair-up in the early game. They allow quick reset strategies on turn 1 of Chapter 5, which can massively reduce the amount of pressure on the early turns in that map. Even if you don't plan to marry these two together, it's still useful to have them fighting together in these early chapters, just because she is the best option to give Lon'qu a mix of strength and defense that he wants in the early game, while he's still a little bit too frail to fight certain enemies on his own. Because Cavalier is a great pair-up class, Lon'qu would also get free skill and free speed out of this pairing as well, which is a nice bonus. This pairing is so useful that I sometimes use my first Seed of Trust on them, just to ensure that they get a C support as fast as possible, and they are arguably the best recipients of the early Seed of Trust, like out of any characters in the game. In the long term, Sully continues to provide pretty much the same value to Lon'qu for the rest of the game, and because they can both be built as physical units, they do a great job of synergizing and fighting together. The already decently fast Sully with a speed support can often double even really fast enemies, as long as she has Lon'qu with her, and this gives him multiple chances to dual strike. If he goes into Assassin, which he pretty much always should, this pair has the ability to play around Aegis Plus or Pavis Plus by switching between bow attacks, or lance attacks, or sword attacks, and just by baiting in dual strikes from each other, you can also play around Aegis and Pavis. This is one of the better ways to make Sully into a great long-term combat unit, because in the long term, you have to solve the issue of speed for any character if you want them to be good, and Lon'qu solves her issue of speed. I really can't overstate how important it is that Lon'qu gives so much speed to his partners and to his children. On that note, Kjelle is a very weird case as a potential daughter for Lon'qu. He only gives her access to 1 additional class. This is not amazing, especially because she already had access to Assassin. Effectively, the only real class she gets from Lon'qu is Trickster, but Trickster does allow her staff access, and it's a physical class with access to staffs, so it's actually not a terrible build for her. However, the real draw here is the insane +6 skill and +6 speed. I'm not going to repeat the same thing 8 more times for the rest of the video, but speed is the most important stat, and there's almost no way to reach the point of diminishing returns. All characters almost always want a little bit more speed, and unlike some of the other potential kids we've discussed, she's actually not too frail either. One really nice build that I recommend getting, which is not too difficult to set up, is inheriting Outdoor Fighter from Sully and Avoid +10 from Lon'qu. If you combine this with Indoor Fighter that Kjelle starts with, because she starts in the night class, this means that she always has +20 Avoid in all situations as soon as you recruit her, and you can refine her build more and more over time towards evasion or defense. But this effectively gives you a character who brings the best aspects of the dodge tanking Lon'qu style build and the pure defensive tanking Frederick or Sully type build, and it combines them into a single character who can both dodge tank but also take attacks when they do get hit. There's a very strong argument for sending her over to Wyvern Rider or promoting her directly into Great Knight, but we can save that discussion for the Kjelle video. Needless to say, class access is not everything. Even though Lon'qu barely gives her any additional classes, if you think about this character in the context of what a complete build looks like, he helps her achieve a surprisingly powerful, combat-ready status almost immediately on her join time. And that's something most Generation 2 characters can't do. Lon'qu is not on the very short list of Sumia supports, but he is able to support with Cordelia, who is probably even the better of the two Pegasus anyway. Cordelia's one problem is that she's not quite as fast as Sumia, and the extra speed that she can get from Lon'qu fixes that problem instantly, and in the long term as well. If you want to make Lon'qu as strong as possible, this one requires a bit of jumping around between classes. He appreciates the bonuses from Hero a lot more than Falcon Knight, but getting Cordelia into Hero is a little bit wonky, and it also grounds one of your flying units, which never feels good. Cordelia is pretty much happy receiving support from any of Lon'qu's best classes, so if you're trying to raise up both characters as a switch duo, or just focusing on Cordelia, he can do a great job as Swordmaster or Assassin, which makes this pairing very easy to make work. It fits into that idea of how we already view Lon'qu, that neither him or Cordelia is going to need very many second seals, and they can just go through their default class lines and they work very well together. On the subject of Severa, she is almost definitely the best second generation unit. One of her great qualities is that, just like Inigo, she can promote directly into Hero, and just like Inigo, she really appreciates inheriting Vantage from Lon'qu. If you do this, she will quickly gain the combination of Soul and Vantage, which massively improves her survivability, great strength, skill, and speed mods. She gets the same epic +6 skill and +6 speed that we've talked about on some of the previous children. Because she has no redundancy with her mother, starting in Mercenary, this means that Cordelia can pass down a good variety of different skills without needing to jump around to different classes. +2 speed is fine, it pushes Severa's natural speed further. Any character who could get Gale Force would love to have Gale Force, especially if they don't need to train for 15 levels in Dark Flyer, so inheriting that is great. Rally speed and rally movement aren't bad if you think you need them, and honestly, even relief can be kind of decent on a soul tank. It just helps ensure that you're going to be back on full health at the start of the turn. This is another character who can immediately be combat viable without needing too much babying, and Lon'qu is a great father for her. If you're planning for the long term, you could even have him pass down one of the breaker skills to improve her matchup against lances or swords, but honestly, on a soul tank, the extra safety net of attacking first with Vantage when your health gets low feels very, very comfortable to me, and I personally prefer this in almost every case. I'll get Swordbreaker or Lancebreaker later on if I want it. As a potential partner for Robin, I think Lon'qu encounters some very weird issues. You basically take all of the best pieces of Lon'qu as a partner, of Robin as a unit, even of Morgan as a unit, and they're all individually very good puzzle pieces. But then you try to fit them together, and they don't seem to actually be part of the same puzzle. That's the best way that I can phrase it. So, for example, if you want to make Robin into a great supporting character, they can do an awesome job of supporting Lon'qu. After all, Robin has access to basically the full female class set, and so she can do just about any build. She can be just as good of a supporter as Miriel or Maribelle. But what's weird is that the main reason to play female Robin instead of male Robin is that she's better at being a top-end offensive build. And I'm not saying this build doesn't work, it certainly works, but it's just different from what people normally do. Having female Robin go through Dark Mage or Troubadour or even both, and then she just ends up in a supporting tier 2 class to optimize Lon'qu's combat performance is okay, but he's not a character who can use Soul, he can't use Gale Force, he can't use Axefair, Bowfair, he can't use Nosferatu. It just feels a little bit off. It feels like you're wasting Robin's potential on a unit who's never going to be top tier. Now, I will say that if you're doing female Sorcerer Robin, she does appreciate the extra speed that she gets from Lon'qu as a husband, so that does work pretty well. It basically ends up looking similar to a Lon'qu and Miriel. The next problem is Morgan. Morgan's greatest strength is his or her ability to start in the starting class of their optional parent. You effectively get to choose their starting class, which also comes with 2 skills, and you can inherit 2 additional skills from Robin and Lon'qu on top of that. Now, what makes this situation weird is that Lon'qu typically shines as a father because he can pass down Vantage. Now, granted, in this case, he's essentially passing down Avoid +10 and Vantage which are both great skills, and one additional skill of his choice, although you might have trouble figuring out what that third skill is going to be. But here's the problem. One of the main reasons you want to pass down Vantage is because it circumvents the issue of being stuck in the Myrmidon class line. Giving Vantage to Severa, as we discussed, is so great because she can promote directly into hero. In the case of Morgan, even if he inherits Vantage and avoid +10 and, let's say, Swordfair, he can't promote directly into hero. So Morgan's ability to have any starting class of your choice, which is his best quality, ends up being wasted because you need to second seal him anyway. It's not a huge issue, and you can use this to your advantage. But again, it feels just a little bit clunky. It feels a little bit off. All of the best offerings of these three units don't synergize well with each other, and you're left figuring out more complicated ways to make them work. You can absolutely have Morgan switch over to Dark Mage or Mercenary, and then run some variation of that build, while benefiting from Avoid +10 and Vantage. But it does come with the downside of needing to train Morgan for 10 additional levels in a base class at a point in the game where that can be a little bit difficult. Alright, we're almost done here. There's only a few more left. Thanks for sticking with me so far, and I hope you're enjoying the video up to this point. Now I want to talk about Nowi, one of my personal favorite characters, despite the fact that she has a lot of drawbacks as a unit. Lon'qu doesn't particularly help her with any of her problems other than speed, but she does a good job of supporting him, especially around the time that she joins. He actually appreciates all of the strength, magic, and defense that she gives him, and the two of them are capable of switch fighting together, where the Dragonstone can be used to play around Counter or Papus Plus, and his Levin Sword or Killing Edge can be used to play around Aegis Plus or even Counter. They will feel good while fighting together for some time, but eventually you're going to run into a little bit of a viability wall that Nowi tends to hit at some point. You either need to keep her in Manakete forever, which doesn't feel great, or you need to switch her over to another class. Now this character who just finished training to level 10 needs to reset back to level 1 and start training again, losing the bonus stats that she was getting from the Dragonstone. At least as a Wyvern Rider, she can serve as a flying utility unit, but the situation isn't great. And here's the problem. I specifically showcased this issue during my ongoing Lunatic Plus run. If you train Nowi and then switch her over to a Wyvern Rider, despite all of the effort you put into her, she compares extremely unfavorably against Cherche in Chapter 12. It's like the opposite of Vake and Gregor. Imagine if you trained Vake and then he was still just an inferior version of Gregor. You could essentially save yourself the effort of training Nowi and using second seals, and instead you have Lon'qu pair up with Cherche in Chapter 12 and have the two of them stick together. Granted, you will be starting from 0 support points and you need to build them up, while Lon'qu and Nowi could already be at the S support by this point, but that is the only real advantage that Nowi has over Cherche. I still run this pairing just because I like these two characters, and you don't always need to play the most optimal way. Using them together is fun, but there's no doubt if you're the kind of person who wants to run more optimal builds, Lon'qu Cherche is essentially just a better version of Lon'qu Nowi. Even if you compare the potential children, the results are grim. Na is one of the extremely difficult to use child units with a limited class set that Lon'qu does not expand very much, and a very strange, unoptimized stat spread. Lon'qu is one of the few ways to fix her absolutely atrocious speed mod, but it's most likely a better idea to use him to give actually good speed to a better character. There's an opportunity cost to using this pairing, and you're giving something up, and you honestly aren't getting much in return. Gerome is one of those units who could never get Gale Force anyway, so Lon'qu ends up being a fairly decent fodder for him if you want to go that route. They essentially play a very similar style of build, and Lon'qu passes down good strength, skill, and speed mods to allow Gerome to be better than decent at combat. You can at least pass Vantage or avoid +10 to Gerome, have him switch to fighter, and then promote to hero. You get a pretty awesome soul tank, axe focused, but let's be honest, this late in the game, it's going to be hard to get that build online if you're not allowing yourself to grind. It's probably better to just go right into Wyvern Lord or Griffin Rider. At the end of the day, if Lon'qu wants or needs a flying partner who can give him some strength and defense, Nowi or Cherche can fill this role. It doesn't matter, either one works. These partners will make Lon'qu better, and Cherche is probably the easier of the two options, but because she joins later, the value of having Nowi support him for all of those early chapters is also very good. That being said, Cherche doesn't require a second seal, you don't need to train her, so that's her benefit. I don't think either of them is going to be his ideal partner anyway, but their interactions are cute and funny, and, well, we don't always need to do the most ideal thing with every character. Again, for me, that would be boring. Panne and Lon'qu fight very well together for many of the same reasons as Sully, so I'm not going to cover the same ground again, and funny enough, Yarne is pretty similar to what we talked about with Gerome, who we were just discussing just now. The big difference between Yarne and Gerome is that he doesn't have access to soul, and Lon'qu can't give it to him. so you could say he probably wants a different father. This hampers his ability to serve as an enemy face sweeper. Having said all that, Yarne does have one advantage over Gerome. He does get Axe Fair, a plus 5 damage stack on top of using the best weapon type in the game. And with the unreasonable god tier plus 7 speed mod that he gets from Lon'qu, on top of good skill, it's pretty safe to say that he's going to double and eliminate most targets. He has the potential to be a very dangerous player face removal tool if you have the patience and the planning to train him for that role. He can never get Gale Force anyway, so you can argue that this is the peak of Yarne's potential. He hits very hard, doubles almost everything, and he can even inherit lethality with a plus 6 skill mod for extra chances to remove targets with crits, lethality, dual strikes. You get it, I've said it many times. If you're playing on Lunatic or lower, and you don't need to worry about counter, you could even inherit Astra instead for the higher skill activation rate to just slam an enemy 5 times with your axe. Next up are the potential Dark Mages, Miriel and Tharja. Dark Mage is not a very fast class, and you want to avoid being doubled, and you would love to double enemies whenever you can. Lon'qu solves that problem. And with his pair of bonuses being either fully speed weighted in Swordmaster or speed magic weighted in Trickster, he makes a great partner for either of these two. Similarly, Miriel and Tharja can give the plus 10 crit bonus from Anathema, which makes Lon'qu even more deadly, makes him better at what he's trying to do. I don't think there's a massive difference between these two units in terms of how they support Lon'qu. Miriel can build into dual support plus, which like Maribelle can make it so Lon'qu is even more absurdly impossible to hit, which can be quite satisfying and surprisingly reliable. Having said that, Tharja, on the other hand, with her mixed class set, is more like a female version of Henry. She has surprising versatility when it comes to supporting physical partners. She brings the benefits of Hex and Anathema over to Sniper and Great Knight. Both Sniper and Great Knight are very good classes for supporting characters like Lon'qu, so at the end of the day, there are a lot of different ideas you can use when planning out a partnership between Lon'qu and either of these characters. If you are seriously planning to use Lon'qu in the long term, and you want to make him as strong as possible as a lead unit, I do think that Miriel and Tharja are probably his two best options. I also think that he is among the best options for supporting either of these two characters if you're using one of them as a lead unit. If you're planning to make a duo that switches back and forth, again, Lon'qu Tharja, Lon'qu Miriel are both very strong cores. Depending on what you need for your team, like if Tharja already has a partner, you could use Miriel for Lon'qu or vice versa. You have a lot of potential here, so much potential. If we wanted to distinguish these potential marriages further, we'd probably have to look at the potential children. As a possible sorcerer Nosferatu tank, LAURENT would absolutely love to inherit Vantage without ever needing to step foot in the Myrmidon line. He also appreciates getting plus 5 skill and plus 5 speed mod from Lon'qu. If he can inherit Tomefair from his mother, he can switch over to Dark Mage immediately, and his build is essentially complete. From that point, you just level him up into sorcerer, and he sweeps through the remainder of the game. As another one of those unfortunate kids who can never get Gale Force, LAURENT really stands out above Yarne and Gerome because of his potential as a Vantage Nosferatu tank. He might not have the capability as a Gale Force attacker, but he can run arguably what is the best enemy face build, the Nosferatu tank. In that sense, Lon'qu is possibly the best parent for him in a no-grinding context, because it allows him to make the most complete version of this build, and he's ready to go from the moment you recruit him. Conversely, because Noire can theoretically obtain Gale Force, you could make the argument that there is an opportunity cost if you give her Lon'qu as a father. She obviously, theoretically, prefers Gaius, Donald, or Robin instead. Having said that, training to level 15 Dark Flyer to get Gale Force is not that easy to do in a no-grinding context, and so in many situations, this point ends up not actually mattering. Not in a theoretical context, but in a practical context, in a real game, all that matters is how good a character can perform during your playthrough. And if she never gets Gale Force, then having Gaius as a father loses a lot of value. Lon'qu as a father can run the same build we've been talking about over and over again here. He passes down Vantage, and then Noire can switch right over to Dark Mage and just be a good Nosferatu tank. The one thing I will say about this pairing is that it does give Noire a lot more flexibility. Between her mother having a mixed class set and Lon'qu having access to good physical classes, she has a lot more potential if she wants to be a Trickster, a Dark Knight, and honestly even a pure physical class like an Assassin or sticking in a Sniper. There is a solid argument for having Lon'qu pass down Astra and then keeping Noire as a Sniper, Sniper is one of the few classes that makes great use of Astra on any difficulty level, even Lunatic Plus, and it is surprisingly difficult to get that Astra Sniper combination. This is one of the few ways to get it really fast. I think there are so many good combinations of marriage supports and second generation builds that Lon'qu enables. He benefits from the good supporters as a lead unit, he supports the good attackers and defenders as a pair-up unit, and he gives one of the most convenient paths to Vantage inheritance, Locktouch inheritance, as well as several other niche skills like builds where Astra or Lethality actually work, and let's not forget that insane speed modifier on himself and his child, and the pair-up bonus he gives to his partner. It is true that Lon'qu can't run any of the S-tier builds himself. First-generation limited class sets tend to have this problem. Most of the Shepherds have a build that is at least partially incomplete in some way. Lon'qu can't be a Gale Force attacker, he can't be a Soul tank, he can't be a Nosferatu tank, but he's just good enough as a unit that you can find a way to use him through the course of a full playthrough, because speed is king in this game, and he has so much of it. And if you are planning for the long term, you can make use of his potential as a father to make some truly terrifying second generation builds that actually work in a no grinding context. Putting aside my own personal feelings as someone who likes this character a lot, I think objectively speaking, he has a lot of strengths that can be leveraged in the context of team building. I consider Lon'qu to be an A-tier character, easily. You should be able to find a place for him in any playthrough, even if that's just helping to get through the tough early game, even if that's just serving as a pair-up bot to give plus speed. And if you're going to use him anyway, you should think about how you could use him to pass down Vantage and his great speed modifier, because it's so easy to do that. All he has to do is train to level 10 and get an S support. Anyway, I promise I will talk about Vake, Donnell, and other fan favorites soon enough, but I really wanted to highlight a character that I personally love and doesn't get talked about as much. I'm trying to shine a spotlight on underrated characters like Miriel and Lon'qu, so if you like this one, go check out the Miriel Emblem video as well. I also really appreciate the likes and comments, so go ahead and leave plenty of those. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.